Olusegun. In today's particular video, we're going to dissect Sotadeology lecture 25, and I call it Dimensionology of Consciousness. This video is going to be quite insightful. It's going to be quite informative. Okay. Well, sorry for that break in transmission. Okay, so as I was saying, this video is going to be quite insightful. It's going to be quite informative because right here in this video, we're going to dissect what reality is. So we're going to treat dimensionology of consciousness. So we're going to see how the virtual or visible consciousness is transcendental, how the feasibility of consciousness is transcendental. Yes, you heard me right. Okay, so basically there are some things I quickly want to touch on before I, dive deeply into why consciousness is transcendent. Sorry, why consciousness is transcendental. So now, basically, if we look at why mathematics is abstract in nature, we know that it's, merely because it's more or less like the construct of the mind. It deals with generalization. If you solve a particular problem, you can actually apply it to, solve myriads of problems as as the problems in question are, related to that particular solution. You can actually generalize. And then for the fact that in science or in math we use axioms, which is more or less like a fundamental assumption based on which one could actually build self-consistent rules, to arrive at solution. But then, if we're now to dissect the validity of any mathematical proof, if we are to dissect that, then we may likely settle for the fact that even mathematics itself is transcendental in its should I say in its calculation or in its method, in its, yes, rather let me say, by its method, mathematics seems to be transcendental. In what way? Now, basically, if we're to look at the fact that whenever you want to balance equation, let's say you want to balance equation, for instance, then you see that your simplification might get to a point where you need to just get a particular value from thin here, right from nowhere. Probably you say you divide both sides by so value, based on the calculation, based on what you are doing, just for you to arrive at the solution, you might be forced to actually, get some numbers from nowhere and then use it for you to arrive at solution. When you look at that kind of method, then we can say that mathematics, by its process, it is transcendental. But then, if we now look at that critically, or we scrutinize that, can we just, based on that, say that whatever proof that we arrive at is not genuine, or what is it that can we say about that? For the fact that we, get value from nowhere to solve mathematics, to me, for the fact that we do that, is not enough for us to say that mathematics proof that we eventually derive is not genuine enough. Because when we look at the fact that even light, we cannot get to see the whole spectrum, or the whole spectrum of light. You understand? Like the title of light in its, should I say, yes, in its spectra, we can't. So there is a feasible range for the eyes, and that is enough to tell us that the information we have access to is a tiny fraction to what is out there for us to actually have access to. You understand? So basically, based on this, we can get to know that whatever proof that we may, eventually settle for in mathematics will actually be based on the fact that we use our mind to construct and to, go in line or according to our mental construct to actually solve that particular problem. You understand? And the reason we might need to do that is because of what I said, that the information that we have access to is limited to what we should have access to for us to actually, prove that indeed something is genuinely real. So based on that, we can get to even say that of course mathematics is transcendental, based on the fact that, mathematicians discovered what is known as imaginary number. You understand? So imaginary number, it's imaginary number, as far as I'm concerned, it shouldn't be a thing in mathematics. You understand? But then we have that. And for so many years, people could not actually, relate with it. They could not actually treat it as something of importance. But then it got to a particular era where mathematicians and even scientists were able to see the importance of that imaginary number. And today, imaginary number is as real as real numbers. You understand? So basically, all these are just pointing to the fact that we are more than what we, how am I going to put it? Like, we are more than what we are currently accessible to have. You understand? So for the fact that you see a human being, you understand, the entitled of the human being that you can see with your physical, or with your physical eyes, that entirety is not the total description, or not the total definition of the man. You understand? So basically, we are far more than who we are as a person or as people. You understand? So now, I'm just saying all those things for us to actually, get the, mindset or the idea behind what reality might be. You understand? So, and if we know that there is need for us to actually, transcend beyond the limit of our definition, or of what we currently have access to, then it means that there is going to be this transition of dimensions. So basically there is going to be transition from one substrate dimension to higher dimension, for us to arrive at reality. So then, apart from the fact that mathematics is transcendental, then another thing that we need to know is that when we look at the nature of infinity, we can get to see this virtue of transcendence in that as well. Because, for instance, when you look at, let us dissect information right now. Now, what is information? What can we say an information is? Basically, what we can say an information is that information can actually serve as attributes of a particular entity. For instance, if you have a real entity, if you get to, extract the attributes of that entity, then you can get information about that particular entity. But then the way I will, try to define what information is I will rather say information is just like the tiny chunks of, more or less like the tiny chunks of a particular entity. The reason I would like to actually use that analogy is because when you think of information the way it is, you can say information is abstract because it is just, attributes of a particular entity. So basically it has relationship with a genuine real entity. But then information is far more than that, because for instance, if you have an information about a particular recipe, the recipe is the genuine material or genuine entity, genuine quantifiable content. You understand? But then you see that when you can actually carry out the instruction of that information to details, you can produce that same recipe. But then the clause there is that you have to, follow the procedure, follow the process to details. Like if you can get every measurement of the ingredient as it is stated in that, that book, you understand, that book of recipe, or as you have in the information of the recipe, if you can follow it to details, then you'll be able to manufacture that same recipe. So we can get reality, we can get, real content right from information. You understand? And we can extract information right from real content. So now, once that is the case, then we can see right here that indeed, for us to now say reality based on my own novel research discovery, with formula of everything, I discovered static and undulating field, and then through that static and undulating field, I realized that before one can actually get reality of the universe, there must be this transmission of information at the speed of time, which is the default speed of time, instant speed. So that instant transmission, the instant there is the key word. And so that is what we're going to actually dive deeply into for us to get what consciousness is, and then, get what reality is for real. Okay, so another thing I want to quickly point to is that apart from the fact that mathematics that we use to describe reality of the universe is abstract, and then by being abstract, we can actually, derive formulas, derive equations and things that we can actually use to, you know, describe the reality of the universe. Apart from that, there is another thing that we might need to dissect for us to really understand this reality we're talking about. When you look at when you look at things in the universe, you will see this kind of relationships between them. For instance, if you look at what I have on my screen, I have two equilateral triangles. Now, don't pay attention to that demarcation to the center dashed horizontal line. If you look at the left side, you see that I have equilateral triangle. Then that equilateral triangle has an inverse of it at the right side. When you look at what we have right here, this is the totality of the universe. You understand? Now, before universe can actually be in existence, it must, have a kind of framework, like a structure that we actually allow it to be in place. And many people don't know that any shape, whatever shape that you have, that shape must, have what is known as relativity. Because in space, you can't just have one point. You must just have 2 points before you can have, the instantiation of any point in the space. You understand? So if you just have one point, you can't relate that point to any other point for that point to be defined as anything. So you must at least have 2 points, and only until then that you can then define the initial point as whatever it is you want to call it, and then the other point as whatever you can call it. So relativity, just like I have said in many of my posts on LinkedIn, that that relativity, I said that observation is delusional of reality. You need to pay attention to this. Observation, because there are two means by which we can get to know reality. The first one is observation. The second one is experience. It's either you observe something when you be at a certain interval to that particular thing. When you observe it, then you see the totality of that thing for you to get the reality of that particular thing. For instance, if somebody is on earth, that person will not be able to see the totality of the earth, and so the person might just, roughly conclude that the earth is flat. But when that person moves away from the earth to a certain distance where the person can actually see the totality of the earth, then the person would know that the earth is spherical. Okay, so now that is observation. Then the second one is experience. So experience is when you are in contact with something, when you feel something for real, you'll experience that thing. So that's another way we can get to know reality, because, even when you are at a certain distance to earth, you get the reality of the earth, but then you will be deluded of the reality of the people on earth, because you have moved far away to the earth to the point where you cannot be certain of the activities of the people on the earth. So that is why reality is somehow difficult for one to decipher, because reality is not what you can get by observation. You just get one part. You get a fraction of reality by observation. And when you experience something, you get, other fraction of it. So basically what I'm saying is that observation is delusional of reality when in relativistic relationship with experience by localization. Observation is delusional of reality relative to the experience by localization. Then experience is delusional of reality relative to observation by globalization. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I'm trying to say is that just what I said earlier. You understand? So now, and there is this caveat to it which says there will be no any emergent reality without relativity. Don't forget that observation is delusional of reality because of being in relativity with experience. You understand? And now I'm saying that we can't have any emergent reality without relativity. Okay, so now let me see how I can paint this in such a way that you'll be able to understand. When you, for instance, let's say you are moving away from the earth and you moved away from the earth to a certain distance where you can get to know the reality of the earth. Now, if you're trying to move towards the earth, as you're moving towards the earth as well will be moving towards you because between you and earth there is this relativity, and relativity will balance the interval between you and the earth in such a way that when you move towards the earth as well will be moving towards you at equal speed. And because of that, you will not be able to, meet earth at the exact point, at the exact location of the earth. So you can see that. You can see the effect of relativity when in place. But then, if you now move away from the earth such that the earth is out of sight, so even though the earth is out of your sight, the earth is somewhere in the space. But if you then move towards the direction of the earth, then the earth will be approaching you too. You understand? And then you see that it will get to a point where the earth will then be visible to your eyes again. But then, how can we now get the earth? How can we move such that we get the earth at its exact location? So the only way we can do that is to move at instant speed. If you can actually move at instant speed from where you are to the earth, you can get earth at its exact location. And that is what reality is all about. That is what reality is all about, and that is what we're going to actually, dissect in this particular video. You understand? So now, we have seen, we have seen things that are actually things that are denying us of reality. We have, have brief idea. Okay, we have had a brief idea about that. You understand? So now, let's see how we can dissect this. Okay, now don't forget that when you have a shape, for instance, equilateral triangle, before you can have any instantiation of any shape, you must have this convergence all around the edges to instantiate such shape. And atypical of such convergence is what we have in this diagram. You can see that big blue convergence and this, big red convergence. So it is ideal for you to have the convergence for such shape to be instantiated. You understand? So the convergence, I call it arbitrary convergence because it is not a convergence that you can, really see with your eyes as such. You understand? But then it's a convergence that we, instantiate the feasibility of the shape. But then let's look at this. We have equilateral triangle. Now, how many equilateral triangle are we going to have to form a circle? We know that when we have 6 equilateral triangle, we can actually form a circle. But then we just need only 2 equilateral triangle to form a circle. So equilateral triangle will now be it will become sectors for the circle. If you have 6 of it, you have the full circle. But then you only need 2 equilateral triangle to have a circle. So by stacking 2 equilateral triangle on each other vertically, you can get to have compacted equilateral triangle all around the edges. And the essence of the compacted equilateral triangle is for you to have constantly accelerated momentum that we, allow for mass accumulation, that will allow us to have alignment of such mass convergence to the curvature of the circle that will be formed. So then, once you have 2 equilateral triangles such that you have 6 compacted equilateral triangle around the edges, then you can have a full circle. But then when we look at a circle is more or less like a transcendental shape, in the sense that by the virtue of its curvature, circle is transcendental. What do I mean by that? Now, let's look at this. I want us to dissect this. When you have a line that is parallel to another line, you say that line, such lines cannot converge. You say such lines cannot converge. Okay? That means they don't intersect, they cannot meet. But that is just a kind of situation where you are on a flat ground. You understand? But then let's dissect a spherical earth or any spherical object. Then you will see that by the virtue of the curvature of that sphere, then you can have the converging of 2 parallel lines. So basically, by the virtue of curvature, there is possibility for us to have such circle to be transcendental. Because when you look at, in that case, what we're actually talking about is now quantum gravity. You understand? Because at quantum level we have mass convergence, arbitrary mass convergence. I call it arbitrary mass convergence because that is right inside the nucleus. We have arbitrary mass convergence. The reason I call it arbitrary mass convergence is for the fact that the electron is undefined until we have, a kind of projected standing wave to, to higher dimension. And then the moment we get connected to the electron of the higher dimension, which will be instantly converted to positron, and then we have the instantiation of the electron of the substrate dimension. So Now, when you look at this, for instance, if you look at what Albert Einstein did, he said, he joined space and time together. So now when you treat the space as being flat, uh, if you have it diagonal to the horizontal trajectory of time axis, then you can see that once curvature is involved, then we're going to have this transcendence, which will allow, because curvature is a virtue of transcendence, is a virtue of transcendence. So because the moment you have the alignment to the curvature of substrate dimension, you are going to have standing wave that will project to higher dimension. And once you have that, you have this connectivity to reality. So now I'm going to be using this diagram that I have on my screen to better explain this reality, what it's all about. And we shouldn't forget that what we want to really dissect is consciousness. Now, consciousness, there are two phases of consciousness. The first phase is what I call objective conscious experience, while the second one is subjective conscious experience. And so we're going to dissect what this consciousness is in this particular video. Now, the title of this video says Dimensionology of Consciousness. So what I'm trying to say is that there is no way we can get any consciousness without having this transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension. So how do we come about this? Now, let's use this diagram. The title of this diagram says the functional information system of time energy wave model. If you have been following me, if you are so conversant with my videos, you know that I derived this particular formula called formula of everything. With that formula, I was able to unify quantum mechanics, classical mechanics, and from there, I was able to get the true nature of quantum gravity. And so quantum gravity, I will, briefly talk about that here. Now, the reason I decided to use this diagram is for the fact that it dissects what functional information is. I want us to really understand this, because with this derivation of formula of everything, I was able to define what self is. Many scientists said the reason we couldn't get reality is for the fact that we can't define the self. You understand? But then the self itself, before we can actually define it, we have to go beyond, the substrate dimension where reality domicile. We have to go beyond, because the substrate dimension will serve as foundation to the higher dimension, and we can't get reality until we get connected to the higher dimension. So now, another thing we need to dissect here is for the fact that when we look at the whole thing, even trying to use mathematics to solve reality, we see that mathematics itself is pointing to transcendental situation. So if you try to use whatever it is that you might want to use, it will actually, lead to this transcendental situation that have been hammering since morning. You understand? But then, why must we have this transcendental phenomenon? Why must we have it? It is not far-fetched. The way I define self, if you look at, I have um, I have it being posted on my LinkedIn. But basically, if you get the video that I titled Quantum Classical Unification, Ash Core 1, that video, I actually did that video to enter Ash Core 1 context, initiative of Kurt Jaimanga podcast, you understand, which is TOE, Theories of Everything. So now that if you get that video, you will get okay, let me quickly see if I can. I want to see if I can get. I just want to see if I can get. This one of my. Well, this is what I shared with you earlier on. One of my post snapshots here. It turns out that observation is delusional of reality relative to experience by globalization, and experience is delusional of reality relative to observation by localization. You understand? So that's just what I shared earlier on. Okay, so I now have that definition of self. I have the definition of self right here. We need to dissect this definition of self for us to, really understand and appreciate what I want to share with us here in this particular video. So now, when you look at what I have here, it says, what am I? That is a tough question that many people, and even many scientists for many years could not define. What am I? Well, the reason I was able to define this is for the fact that God inspired this, and apart from that, mathematics was actually used, because when you use mathematics, you can actually go beyond your limit, and that is why I was actually talking about maths being transcendental. You understand? Even when you dissect the process, the method of mathematics, the way we eventually arrive at solution, when you look at the axiomatic conditions, when you look at the generalization and things like that, you get to know that mathematics is transcendental. So now, what am I? Please, I want you to dissect this definition of self quite all right for you to understand, because once you understand this quite all right, you are going to understand everything I'm going to explain quite all right. It is thoroughly backed by mathematics, like my novel research discovery, my research publications, they are thoroughly backed with mathematics. So now, what am I? I am an embodiment of functional information that is dynamic as informed by higher degree of freedom for instantiation of self-aware worth. Therefore, I am created by Almighty God, a supreme being without whom I am unfulfilled. Listen, the definition of self stops at where we have self-aware worth. I am an embodiment of functional information. Embodiment of functional information. Now, based on my novel research discovery, the only means by which we can get solution to reality is by having instant transmission of information. Now, when you look at that, you might say that is quite impossible. You can't even say it is quite impossible because we have quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement has proved that information can be transmitted instantly. But then scientists are now saying that such transmission might not be even useful. You understand? But then, let's try and dissect instant transmission of information. When something is said to be transmitted instantly, even for something to be said to even for something to be transmitted at all, it must actually move from a source to a destination. It must move from a kind of localized instantiation to another localized instantiation. That is transmission. You can't say something is transmitted without having it move from one place to another. But then, if we dissect that, we can see that there is this virtue of localized instantiation in that old definition of instant transmission of information. And so if we have such localized instantiations, which we can call source and destination. Now, the information is transmitted. We know that information we have to move from the source to destination. But then, how does that information move? How does that information move? Instantly. So that is where the main issue is. How can we define something that is transmitted instantly? For us, the best way I can define that is that if we have the source and destination, if we can have a kind of transmission such that there will be genuine contact from the source and then genuine contact at the destination, then we then have instant transmission. If we have a kind of transmission that we have genuine contact from that source and then genuine contact to the destination, we have instant transmission. I'm going to actually prove this with time energy wave model. You understand? Because in the time energy wave model, when you apply formula of everything, we realize that you cannot get genuine contact at both ends. You either get genuine contact and then get suspension at the other end. That is for anything that is physical. By the virtue of that localization, you are going to have suspension. And then by the virtue of globalization, we have genuine contact at the other side. So now, for that information to be functional, the information has to travel instantly, because it's only by traveling instantly that we can actually get the localized point at where it ought to be. You understand? So now, I am an embodiment of functional information that is dynamic as informed by higher degree of freedom. Higher degree of freedom, that is, when you look at the quantum level, we realize that right inside the entropy, the moment we have spontaneous symmetry breaking, then we're going to have mass accumulation right inside compacted equilateral triangle. Equilateral triangle will be compacted to have constantly accelerated momentum because we are around the curved region, and because of that, there will be influx of tiny introduction of energy, and so that will be treated in such a way that it will seem as if running on treadmill. That's why I said constantly accelerated. You understand? Kind of constantly accelerated phenomenon. So it will be similar to being on treadmill, having a kind of movement that cannot be translated to moving from one point to another. Okay, so now, the dynamic that is dynamic as informed by higher degree of freedom for instantiation of self-aware worth. Now, the quantum electron is not defined at quantum level. We realize that by having the standing wave to connect to higher dimension, because of connecting to higher dimension to have higher degree of freedom, then we could have the instantiation of that electron of the higher dimension, which will be instantly converted to positron, and then we now have the instantiation of electron. You understand? And having this new development in such a way that new development is transmitted instantly back to the mass worth, the classical mass worth. That is what is known as consciousness. So the genuine location of the electrons of the higher dimension, which is instantly converted to positron, which will now allow for the instantiation of the electron of the substrate, and then the feedback transmission of such information at instant speed of time to classical mass worth. That is what I call objective conscious experience. Because at that point, we will be able to get the exact location of classical mass worth in relation to the exact location of that quantum electron. And that is what the subjective conscious experience we have to work on. And knowing the exact location of quantum mass worth relative to the exact location of the classical mass worth, that is what I call self-awareness. So now, with that, we can get to, because we know we are able to get that virtue of consciousness in form of transmission of information, which must be done instantly. That is why I said I am an embodiment of functional information. It is not just an ordinary information. Information, like I said the other time, we have huge, vast spectrum of light, but we only have access to a tiny fraction of the whole spectrum of light. You understand? So the constraint which we allow for that functional information will be made possible by what is known as flipping mechanism. Flipping mechanism, I have treated that severally in my previous videos. Flipping mechanism is for you to, just the same way you have multiple of light speed in time measure, so must you have an inverse of genuine information, which when flipped will give you, this kind of filtering mechanism, which will then constrain you to what is ideal. Because we have sea of information, there is quantitative arrangement which would not give you any kind of semantic information. It will only give you syntactic information. But then, when information is being flipped by its inverse version to constrain to what is ideal, it is then that information is functional. When you now have it being constrained or being reduced to ideal streams of information, you understand, such that we now have the connectivity that will not leave any traces of mark, the kind of connectivity, the kind of unification that will not leave any traces of mark at all. That is what I call functional information. So now, let's look at this once again. Let us dissect this. What am I? I am an embodiment of functional information that is dynamic as informed by higher degree of freedom for instantiation of self-aware worth. Now we have the whole biological mass convergence right there. We have flesh, you understand, and the flesh itself is, of course, the flesh itself will grow because the flesh will expand. When a woman is pregnant, the flesh will expand. So the flesh the flesh itself is alive. You understand? So now we need to know that we become a unique being, or we become an advanced being at every instance of learning. At every instance of learning, we become a unique being. So we usually have this transformation of identity as we learn. That is why I said is dynamic. I said I am an embodiment of functional information that is dynamic, as informed by higher degree of freedom for instantiation of self-aware worth. Now we know that the electron of the quantum level cannot be instantiated without getting connected to higher dimension. Then the transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension is what I call complex system. So now with that, with formula of everything, I'm able to define what self is. And so we're going to actually drill deeply into this for us to get that reality, the full picture of reality. So I want to take us back to So I want to take us back. Back. Okay. Okay, so now we are now here, the functional information system of time energy wave model. So now this is how it works. Now you can see here, right at the left region where I have this functional info space, we have this constraint to that compacted space because there is this flipping mechanism that we allow that to happen. So even though we have now you can see this, look at the equilateral triangle, look at where we have arbitrary information space of the classical. So this entire arbitrary information space, the whole information that we have there is not ideal for what will be functional. And so out of the entire information space, we only have this tiny functional info space which will be functional. That is for the classical level. Now let's see where the functional information at quantum level is. Now this whole region, you can see the whole region of arbitrary information space. Now the functional space is where we have the transition from the substrate dimension to higher dimension. Can you see that? Can you see that? So now this whole 2D time energy wave diagram, that is the 2D. You understand why this, small drawing down here, that is the higher dimension, which is in this case will be 3D. Okay, so now how do we get all this? How do we get this equilateral triangle? How do we get the curvature of time? Now don't forget that time wave is this blue curvature. The energy wave is this red curvature. Okay, so now by applying formula of everything, do I have formula of everything here? Okay, Formula of everything is dt dm equal to capital Um plus 4m. That is formula of everything. Now, when you put the quantum mass worth, let's say electron, if you put that electron's mass worth, let's say that is 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 31 kilogram. If you put it in that formula of everything, you are going to get the classical counterpart of that to be this particular value, 2,227,250,000 kilogram. That is the classical counterpart of that electron's mass worth. But for us to now get the whole reality, now you can see that we can move from the quantum mechanics to classical mechanics. So now at this central trajectory, we have the instant trajectory of time, and that is what allows for the unification of quantum mechanics to classical mechanics. Now, when you look at this horizontal dashed line to where we have the blue curvature, that is the old classical realm. Then from the dashed line down to where we have the red curvature, that is the old quantum realm. So now by having we have the divergence of classical mechanics to quantum mechanics by having this diagonal linear trajectory. So you can see that we have action trajectory, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power 32. Then we have reaction of that in energy, in form of energy. We have the action of time trajectory to be inversely related to the reaction of that same trajectory in energy. So you can see the figure that we have, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 32. So that is just an inverse of this. So now, when you now use this classical mass worth in the place of 2m's in the formula of everything, the answer you will get will be this value, 5.7 times 10 raised to power 48. Now, if you expand this value in standard form, then you have couples of zeros. You have zeros that will suspend the value of the 4m, and so the value of the 4m is what we have as this big blue convergence. The value of that 4m to value of the capital Um in the formula is, the value will now be 9,109 instead of 9.109. It will be 9,109, and then it will be suspended at 32nd position. But then with that, we know that the trajectory is at classical level. So now, when you look at this diagonal line, we have red line meeting the blue line. What we have there is known as relativity, because the moment you have such momentum in space, then a central point will be created within the interval, and that is what is called relativity. So any movement towards each other or away from each other will be equal. So now we know that diagonal trajectory. We know it's a diagonal trajectory because it will emerge from a singularity, diagonally towards where we have the suspension of the weak conveying value. So the 4m's value is what I call weak conveying value. So now we have this action in time, we must have reaction of that in energy, and that is what we have here. So now this diagonal linear trajectory in energy is the constancy of light, while this diagonal linear trajectory is the constancy of gravity. And so we can as well call it divergence of classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. But then, how do we now have this baseline? How do we have this vertical trajectory? We have the vertical trajectory by manually annihilating the suspended zeros, only the suspended zeros. Now, annihilating suspended zeros will not exert any kind of energy, and so it's going to be in form of free fall. So basically, we're going to have a kind of spontaneous free fall. So the free fall that we have, which is classical gravity, will be from this big blue convergence down to this red convergence. Okay, so now don't forget that here we have compacted the collateral triangle. I call this quantum nucleus. Because the equilateral triangle is being compacted, we will have constantly accelerated momentum. So that speed difference is the main issue. The speed difference will now allow for accumulation of mass worth. So because the trajectory, the vertical trajectory is from this big blue convergence down to this red convergence, we have enough energy gap that can cause spontaneous symmetry breaking. And the moment we have it, we're going to have mass accumulation around the spot of electron, which will be aligned with the curvature of this energy. And then once we have that, we're going to have standing wave, which will project us into the higher dimension. And the moment we get connected to the electron of the higher dimension, which will be instantly converted to positron, for us to have the instantiation of the electron of the substrate dimension, then the instant feedback of that to the classical mass worth, you can see that we have the real classical mass right here. Can you see that here? This is it. So now you can see that this classical mass worth is being suspended to where it's supposed to be. Where it's supposed to be is this point of intersection. The point where we have the intersection of vertical trajectory to horizontal trajectory. That is where the classical mass worth should be. Now, that is what I was trying to say, that at the two extreme ends, we don't usually have genuine contact at both ends. We get genuine contact at one end and then have suspension at the other end. And that is why the only solution can only be in form of instant transmission of information. So now the whole reality is transformed to information. And don't forget what I said at the beginning of this video, that information is, having attribute of an entity. But then you can say by definition, information is not a genuine entity, but you can derive a genuine entity from information just as you extract information from genuine entity. You understand? And that is why I made mention of the recipe. If you want to make a recipe, if you have information about how you can make that recipe, if you follow that to details, you can actually produce that same recipe. So now you can see that the instant feedback that we have, we're able to get the exact location of classical mass worth relative to the exact location of quantum mass worth. But then at this complex level, because the transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension is what I call complex system. So now at this complex level, we have genuine contact. You can see that we have genuine contact here. And it is that genuine contact that allows for the instantiation of the substrate, for the instantiation of the electron of the substrate dimension, rather. Okay, so now the first phase, this vertical trajectory is where we have the first phase of consciousness, which is the objective conscious experience. Now, it is very important for us to dissect the transcendental nature of consciousness in form of what I call dimensionology of consciousness. So it is, you can see that we have the reality in the substrate, but then we can't have that reality without getting connected to higher dimension, because we won't even have the instantiation of electron in first place. So now, higher degree of freedom can actually allow the electron is we couldn't have electron because of the huge temperature, the pressure right inside the nucleus. But the moment we have that relativity to higher dimension, and higher dimension will give us higher degree of freedom, there we can have the instantiation of the electron that will be converted to positron to allow for the instantiation of the electron of the substrate dimension. So now you can get to now see that consciousness must first get its objective phase before transiting to subjective phase. So now we know with this objective conscious experience, we know what the problem is. This first phase will give us what is known as self-awareness. So we can get to know the exact location of classical mass words to the exact location of quantum mass words. But then we know that classical mass worth is not where it's supposed to be. So now, the moment we have injection of the electron of the higher dimension into the substrate, we're going to have what is known as energy energized. So right here, we have electron to be at its lowest energy state. And if, as we know, when you have electron to be at its lowest energy state, the only way you can excite that electron is for you to inject energy, probably maybe in form of shining light, laser beam, or whatever it is. You inject energy for you to excite the electron to move to higher energy state. And so energy will be energized, and so when we have momentum towards the core singularity of the black hole, as we have that momentum towards the core singularity of the black hole, then this classical mass what will be relocated to the exact position, which is the point of intersection of horizontal trajectory to vertical trajectory. So the moment we have that momentum to reach the core singularity of the black hole, we will have had the classical mass words to be at the point of that intersection. So now then we now know that what we have there is known as subjective conscious experience. Why is it a subjective conscious experience? It is a subjective conscious experience because the moment we have that introduction of energy, the influx of energy to energize electrons so as to have momentum towards the core singularity of the black hole, we have mixture of noise and real signal, because noise will be mixed with signal. And so subjective conscious phase will have to filter the noise from the signal, and so the noise will be packed towards the core singularity of the black hole, and then the signal will be redirected towards the central point at the vertical trajectory. So that is that about consciousness. So we can't even have consciousness without getting connected to a higher dimension. And that is actually pointing to the fact that reality of the substrate is at higher dimension. So what do I mean by that? 2D, which is 2 dimension, is incomplete without being connected to higher dimension 3D. Now we can see if the reality of the 2D, which is the foundation of this system, is dependent on the higher dimension, which is 3D, then we know that that is actually pointing to, when you have something that is bigger than you, when you're connected to something bigger than you, like we human beings as we are, if we now say that our whole reality or the full reality is dependent on higher dimension, we know that basically we are referring to Almighty God, because since we are pointing to the higher dimension, we know that we are referring to a supreme being, something that is bigger than us. So basically, this whole system is pointing to is actually pointing to the existence of Almighty God. So that's why I said in that definition of self that, though in the definition of the self, I said as defined by higher degree of freedom, to allow for the instantiation of self-aware worth. That's what I said. But basically, that is actually pointing to Almighty God. So now, it is not so far-fetched for us to understand this. For instance, let me give you an instance. If you have a 2D plain sheet of paper on the ground, the only way you can get to know that that 2D paper, the plain sheet, the only way you can get to know that the 2D being in that state is not actually having its full potential is by putting ants on it. When you have ants on that paper, you see that the ants will not be able to cross to explore the other side. The 2D plain sheet of paper has 2 sides, and it is only ideal for the ant to explore the 2 sides for us to know that the 2D paper, is at its full potential. So if the ant can only explore just one side of the paper, then it means that the position of that 2D is not the ideal position for that 2D paper to be, because the ants can't even explore the entire sides of the paper. But the moment we lifted that paper up, we can see that the ant will be able to cross the boundary of the paper, then explore the 2 sides. But by lifting up the paper, we have actually unified that 2D to 3D. It has become 3D because it is being lifted up from the lowest energy state. Energy is being introduced. Now, you can see that that cannot be done without having somebody who can lift the paper. You understand? But then, the person that lifted up the paper was able to do so because the person was actually in 3D, and so the person could see that the paper can actually explore that, up axis. You understand? But then, if we now consider that there is somebody that is at higher dimension to the person that lifted the paper, and the person is now telling the person that lifted the paper that the paper as it is on the ground is at its highest or full potential. So, if there is another person at higher dimension telling the person of that 3D that, there is now a huge problem. So, how come the ant is unable to explore the 2 sides? because the ant's reality is limited as such. But how can we get to prove the fact that even while the 2D paper is on the floor, it is actually at its 3D formation, which would allow the hands to explore the two sides? Because for that 2D paper, plain sheet of paper, to be in 3D formation, all we have to do is just to take the extreme ends of the paper to take it across such that the two ends will face each other, then give each side half twist and glue them together. It will form moving strip. Then we have that unification to 3D formation. So with that moving strip, the ant can actually explore the two sides without crossing any border. The border has vanished, the 2D has become 3D, but then we have the unification of two 2Ds, which are inversely related to each other, for us to have that newly developed identity. But then, how can we have that while the paper is on the ground? But then when you now dissect the fact that the paper being on the ground doesn't mean that the paper is void of momentum, because the virtue of momentum is enough factor for that paper to be twisted into its 3D formation. So what do I mean by that? You know that when we get to the point where we have compacted the equilateral triangle, we have constantly accelerated momentum. Now, the virtue of that difference of constantly accelerated momentum has catapulted the whole system into mass convergence system. And if we could have mass convergence, which could give us standing wave projection into higher dimension, then we know that the quantum gravity is that tiny resistance, which is, the mass convergence as we have it. But then the mass convergence will be, equated with the acceleration, such that, for instance, if you have a string with a ball at its extreme end, if you want to swing that string such that the string will balance in the air, you will have to increase acceleration, and then you have to maintain a particular constant momentum for that ball to be lifted in the air and be turning. So you can see that accelerated momentum has given us a kind of balance which is known as quantum gravity. So the balance, gravity is all about balance. The classical gravity, when you look at the face of classical gravity, we have free fall. Free fall is where you have a kind of momentum where the weight of your mass what will not be felt. So momentum, you have a momentum that is translated to weight loss in classical gravity. And then the quantum gravity has to be inverse of that, which means that you have a momentum which will translate to mass accumulation. So the tiny that we have is what is known as quantum gravity. And so we can only get to see quantum gravity in classical gravitational phase by having relativistic suspension. So if you have somebody, let me give you an example of that. If you have somebody that is actually falling from a particular height, the person will be falling, the person will not, feel his weight. But then if the person has a face cap, and the person should take away the face cap and put it above himself, the face cap will not touch the person. The face cap will maintain the interval. and then you can see the suspension of the face cap to that falling person. So only by relativistic connection you can get to see the effect of quantum gravity. The quantum gravity is so tiny that is so insignificant at classical level. But then in the space, you have the floating of astronauts. They call it microgravity. That is quantum gravity for you. So the effect of floating or suspension is more pronounced there in the space. So now, so good, we now know what consciousness is, but then we get to see that that relativistic transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension is so needed. So I have done 3 videos. The first one, I call it Dimensionology of Generalized Intelligence. The second one, I call it Dimensionology of Information. In that of the information, you could see that we have the perspective of 2D as it receives information from the higher dimension in form of 2D, that is in form of motion, in form of motion. You understand? So it has the slice of the information to be in 2D, but then we have the running of the information in motion. So by having such motion means that we have that information from higher dimension. So by having motion itself can be translated to transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension. And that is why I said, by getting to know that the paper is on the floor, and then the floor of the building is on earth, and the earth itself is rotating, it's not static. So it's just that the paper is moving at constant speed of that earth rotation. You understand? And that is why it seems as if the paper is static. So by the virtue of that, we get to know that, yes, then the momentum we allow for that 2D to be in its 3D form. But then the 3D form can allow the hands to explore the two sides. So now, basically, you can get to see that reality is pointing to the fact that we are more than what we envisage ourselves to be. And then the dimension, whatever dimension of reality is, connected to higher dimension for the feasibility of such reality to be fulfilled. So basically, that is the whole essence of the consciousness. That is the whole essence of the whole thing. Now, dissect this video. You can play and replay it. Then make sure you share this video. I will put links to my research publications, to my book on Amazon, and all those, my social media. You can get to download my research publication, explore the formula of everything, explore the time energy wave function. By using time energy wave function, I was able to get, the true nature of that flipping mechanism. And then don't forget that the flipping mechanism is what I call the signature of Almighty God, because it is everywhere. The light, in light, we have flipping mechanism. You can only measure the two multiple speed of light in time, and then you will have it being inversely related to each other. Then we have flipping mechanism in DNA. You see all the letters of DNA, we have them being flipped like that. So we have flipping mechanism everywhere. The inverse of classical mechanics is quantum mechanics. The inverse of electron is positron. So we have this flipping mechanism for the instantiation of reality. And so formula of everything is a genuine formula that has helped us to, unravel the mystery of the universe. So that is that. And this is Dimensionology of consciousness. Now, if you really want to understand the whole concept, make sure you watch Sotadeology lecture 23, which is Dimensionology of generalized intelligence. Sotadeology 24, lecture 24. Watch that, which is Dimensionology of information. Then Sotadeology lecture 25, which is this one, Dimensionology of consciousness. So that is that. I thank you all for your time. Remain blessed forever. Please don't hesitate to share this my video. Let people know that indeed we have, classical mechanics, unification to quantum mechanics. Thank you. God bless you. I will call it a day right here.